I want to welcome everyone. Let me try that again. I want to welcome everyone back to our sixth lesson in our series, The Kingdom and the Covenants. I'm just going to real quick make sure that I've got everything muted here and you're not going to get any feedback. All right, looks like we're good to go. All right, we are tonight beginning the life of Abraham. We have made our way now for a number of lessons, 5 lessons through the first 11 chapters of Genesis, what are called the Genesis prologue. Tonight we're coming to Abraham, and I want to just begin this evening with a quote from a writer named Douglas Bannerman in a book called The Scripture Doctrine of the Church, where he describes the place that Abraham holds in Scripture as a whole. I think you'll resonate with this, those of you who know your Bibles well. He says, quote, "The more we study what is said in Scripture of Abraham and the events of his life, the more we shall be struck with the peculiarity and loftiness of the position which he holds. His name stands out from the first as a mighty landmark in the history of redemption. It has been calculated that in the later books of the Old and New Testaments there are about 100 references to the covenant made with Abraham, as compared with some 8 or 10 references to the covenants with Adam and with Noah. As the centuries of the history of Revelation roll on, the call and the obedience of Abraham stand out more and more clearly as forming in many respects the greatest epoch between the fall and the coming of the Savior. At each great step taken afterwards in the development of God's purposes of grace toward men, there is some reference to the revelation made to Abraham. At each great revival of spiritual life among God's people, at each turning point in their history, there is a fresh taking hold of the covenant made with Abraham and of the promises given to him and to his seed," unquote. Now, to give an illustration of what Bannerman is saying, I don't think it would take too much close reading of the Old Testament to see that the very greatest work of saving grace from Genesis to Malachi would have to be the Exodus from Egypt. That gets referred to time and time again. It's a very powerful, evocative story, and both Moses himself, of course, in the law, and later the prophets are constantly talking about the Exodus. But it's interesting that the Exodus is explicitly portrayed as a remembrance on God's part and a fulfillment on God's part of the covenant that he made with Abraham. And I just wanted to read a few verses from Exodus chapter 2, where God has the king, the new Pharaoh in Egypt doesn't remember Joseph, and we're told in Exodus 2, at the end of the chapter, that the cry of the Israelite slaves for rescue from slavery came up to God. And then it says this, "And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew." Just one of many references that point out that the Exodus, as grand and important and pivotal an event as that was a fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but that's going to become important later as we begin exploring the law of Moses and begin to relate to this very big question of how Moses and what God does through Moses relates back to his promises to Abraham. So keep this in mind. But in Genesis itself, before we get to things like the Exodus, in Genesis itself, the significance of Abraham, I think, is highlighted in the very structure of the Genesis narrative. And I want to just take a few minutes here. And by the way, you should have, underneath your live stream there, you should have a copy of the study notes. There's a link you can click on there to have a look at those. Might be able to follow along with some of this, the outline at least. But I want to talk about Abraham against the background of the Genesis prologue. His story against the background of Genesis 1 through 11. Now you'll remember, we're going to go back to this again and again through our study of the Bible. Genesis 1 and 2, right? That's the goodness with which it all begins. Genesis 3 is where the bad news begins. But Genesis 1 and 2 introduce what human beings are for. I'm borrowing that phrase from Wendell Berry there. What are people for? Well, what are people for? Genesis 1 and 2 shows us. And we saw there that human beings are made in God's image for 3 things. These are, I would say, the 3 big kind of categories or pieces of human life. One, of course, is communion. That's pretty obvious. Not just communion person to person, say between Adam and Eve, but communion with God. Human beings were made to listen to God, to trust God, to obey God, right? Communion, secondly, dominion. In communion with God, human beings were to rule the earth. They were to form and fill, just as God formed and filled the empty, the empty watery waste in Genesis 1, chapter 2 and following. Adam and Eve are to form and fill particular gardens where they are placed by God, filling those gardens with the goodness and the order and the beauty of God. As God built the heavens and the earth, they are to build gardens and homes in the world. So communion, dominion, and thirdly, mission, because you'll remember that in Eden there were these 4 rivers, not just the garden, but through that garden 4 rivers running out to the ends of the earth, a kind of picture for us there that the covenantal life, the kingdom life that God intended for the garden in Eden, that life and blessing that he gave to his human subjects there, that was to flow out to every corner of God's kingdom throughout the world. The earth was to be filled with the glory of God, as it was in Eden. That's what people are for: communion, dominion, mission. Now in Genesis 3, of course, this all begins to unravel. Our first parents lost that original paradise kingdom by breaking communion. That was what went first. They did not listen, did not trust, did not obey God. They broke communion with God. And by doing so, they forfeited their dominion over the garden. And when they went out from the garden, and especially in the line of Cain, instead of filling the earth with God's glory, sinners filled the earth with violence. So there's kind of an inversion of every one of these. Broke communion, lost dominion, really subverted the mission. Now after God, and I don't want to put it too crudely here, but after God, in a sense, sort of hit the reset button in the flood with his plans for the world, you'll remember that humankind in Genesis chapter 11 engaged in a massive effort to reunite, or to stay united, in dominion and communion, at least with each other, but they wanted dominion and communion without God. Right? That's what the Tower of Babel is largely about. We want a giant edifice of our dominion in the world that reaches up into heaven. We, by our own efforts, will unite heaven and earth. We don't need communion with God. We want to all stay together in this city. We want to join forces in this city. But of course, God just scrambles that, because you cannot reach heaven by a stairway. God must lower the stairway to his dwelling place. You can't build it from the ground up. God must initiate grace toward humankind. He must open a way into his holy presence. That is God's work to do, and God's alone. And humankind must respond to that stairway that God lowers by faith. Now, we saw it both before and after the Babel account, that the human mission of filling the earth, going out to the ends of the earth, that mission was in some sense divinely imposed as God scattered humankind after their rebellion against him at Babel. So in a sort of perverted sense, humankind is still on mission after Babel. But the communion with God, that central feature of human life, and dominion as God's obedient stewards in the world, communion and dominion are going to have to be restored by some other means. Even though humankind is filling the earth, and they're doing some good things. They're building culture, and it's not all just horrible, violent evil. Communion and dominion as God intended it is not, as Genesis 1 through 11 come to a close, those are just sort of hanging in the air. They must be restored by some means other than the project that humankind's attempted at Babel. So it's against that backdrop, that very dark backdrop of worldwide human rebellion. Humankind under repeated divine judgments in the flood, in the Tower of Babel and so on. Then suddenly in chapter 12, the narrative of Genesis sharply narrows down to this one man and his family. And their story will run all the way to the end of Genesis, and really all the way to the end of the Bible. And the fact that there's this very broad exploration of the human plight that suddenly narrows down to this one man, it shows us that God's grace to Abram, or later known as Abraham, this grace shown to this man and his family and his seed, this is the solution to the problems that have been so graphically presented in Genesis 3 through 11. Especially, God's grace to Abram is the solution to the problem of humankind's losing communion with God and losing dominion over the earth. Or to put it all another way around, as Graham Goldsworthy expresses it in his book According to Plan, quote, all of world history is related to the promises that God makes to Abraham. You really cannot understand the story of the human race truly without understanding God's grace and intentions toward Abraham. Now that worldwide focus, this is so important. That worldwide focus of the Abraham story that we can see in the very structure of Genesis itself, it emerges, interestingly, explicitly in the very first words that God speaks to Abram. In chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, the first promises that God, very first promises that are recorded that God makes to Abram, that worldwide focus, as we'll see in a moment, comes explicitly into expression. Now, let's just pause here and talk a little bit about this call to Abram and God's first promises to him. Now, as we noted last time, given the introductory details at the very end of chapter 11, as we're kind of winding our way through Abraham's genealogy, his ancestors, down to him, we saw last time as we closed our lesson that Abram is not a promising candidate to bring life to the world at all. In fact, there's just death kind of throughout the story of his forefathers and even his own immediate family. His brother is dead, we learn in chapter 11, verse 28. He is married to a woman, Sarai, whose womb is dead. Even though his name means Abram, Avram means exalted father. It's kind of a joke because he is married to, his wife's womb is dead. He lives near Babel. Ur of the Chaldeans is near Babel, which doesn't give us any good vibes coming out of Genesis 11. Then after the initial call that God makes to him in Ur of the Chaldeans, we read about that in Acts chapter 7, verses 2 through 4, he begins this long journey west to a place called Canaan, some 1,100 miles or so. And that journey west seems to miscarry when he comes to a place called Haran, where his father decides to settle, and his father, we're told, also dies there some 60 years after Abram eventually moves on toward Canaan. In chapter 11, verse 32, we learn that his father dies in Haran. So death just hangs over this household like a stench. And yet, to this very unpromising, childless wanderer with a laughable name, God's call comes again. Abram is now 75 when it seems that these words in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, it seems that this is kind of repetition of the call made in Ur. Now it comes to him in Haran. Or maybe it's referring back to the original call that God made in Ur. But either way, to this very unpromising character, God calls. God comes and speaks. I'm belaboring this a little bit because this is a story of what the Bible refers to as election. This is a very powerful, very important biblical doctrine. God chooses us. God initiates His grace. We do not build our way into heaven. We do not work our way toward God. We do not initiate. We would never turn to God except for His sovereign grace reaching out to us. He comes to us and drags us out of darkness. He chooses us. We do not choose Him. And the only explanation for this is the sovereign mercy of God Himself. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, you may know these verses well. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. Therefore, it is, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. And that goes all the way back. It goes even before Abraham, but it certainly is here in the story of Abram. This man is not a very promising character, but God comes and He calls him. Get out from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed, God says. So this man is called out of the east. You remember that when things are moving eastward, in early Genesis, that's not a good sign. Adam and Eve are cast out to the east. Cain moves to the east. Well, now Abram is being called back west to God's garden, we might say. The promised land. And as I just read, initially God gives him three promises. What are the three things that you see here? You see these three elements of land, seed, and blessing. Which against the backdrop of Genesis 1 through 11, addresses what we have seen to be the universal human problems. Someone once defined, I believe it was Graham Goldsworthy, defined God's kingdom, which is what Genesis and the Bible are all about. God's kingdom is God's people in God's place under God's rule. God's people in communion, in God's place, taking dominion, under God's blessing, His rule, and taking that communion and dominion to the ends of the earth. God is determined since the first moment of creation that He is going to have a people in communion with Him. He's going to put those people in a place of dominion, and they are going to enjoy the prosperity of His blessing. So land, seed, and blessing address these fundamental human problems of people, place, and prosperity. And when you think about human problems under the sun, you can reduce just about every problem people have. They're either people problems, they're place problems, or they're prosperity problems. And God makes these three promises of land, seed, and blessing to Abram here. And He explicitly says, here's the mission part, that God will extend through Abram blessing to all the families of the earth. There again, there's that worldwide focus in the very first set of promises God makes. Let me just take a little sidebar here. I don't want to take too much time with this. But many of you, like myself, have spent a lot of your Christian life maybe under a teaching known as premillennial dispensationalism. And dispensational premillennialism. Dispensationalism teaches that it very strongly emphasizes the literalness of the promises made to Abraham, but in a way that largely reduces the Abrahamic promises to Abraham's physical descendants. There is a kind of narrowness in the dispensational understanding of the Abrahamic promises and the later promises to Israel that I think sits uncomfortably with this universal worldwide emphasis we see from the very beginning of what God does with Abraham. I want to read here a quote from a dispensationalist theologian named Charles Ryrie. Now listen to this. He says, quote, premillennialism, let me just pause. Of course, premillennialism is the idea that we're waiting for Jesus, usually in dispensationalism, we're waiting for the rapture of believers, and then God is going to sort of restart His plans for the nation of Israel that were suspended when Jesus ascended back into heaven and the church age began. But that when Jesus raptures out the church, then God will establish the millennial kingdom on earth with the believing Jews, with Israel. And that's when we're going to see all these promises that God made to Abraham come to fulfillment. And so, hence the word premillennialism. Ryrie says here, quote, premillennialism insists that all of the provisions of the Abrahamic covenant must be fulfilled since the covenant was made without conditions. Much of the covenant has already been fulfilled and fulfilled literally, therefore what remains to be fulfilled will also be fulfilled literally. This brings the focus on the yet unfulfilled land promise. Though the nation, Israel, occupied part of the territory promised in the covenant, she has never yet occupied all of it, and certainly not eternally, as the covenant promised. Therefore, there must be a time in the future when Israel will do so, and for the premillennialist, this will be in the coming millennial kingdom. Thus, the Abrahamic covenant gives strong support to premillennial eschatology, unquote. Now, without saying, again, too much about this, that just doesn't seem to quite square well with the fact that even though it was Canaan in particular that was promised to Abram and his physical descendants, there's, from the very beginning, there's not only this emphasis on all the families of the earth, but all the families of the earth are not going to live in Canaan. So there is a kind of geographic universalism too, that this blessing is going to extend to the ends of the earth. So let's get back to this threefold promise, and I've given you in your notes there a really wonderful article by Paul Williamson you can read that unpacks some of this more. But I want you to notice, as the story of Abram gets started, that there is a certain order or a certain priority to these three blessings. Land, seed, blessing. Sorry, three promises, land, seed, blessing. And I've described those as people, place, and prosperity. But you'll notice there's a certain order, there's a certain priority in which these will be given to Abram and his seed. Because, note this carefully, what's more important, people, place, or prosperity? Think about that for a minute. Without a people graced by God and formed for God, we're going to have the Eden problem all over again, aren't we? Give people a wonderful place and give them great prosperity. That can lead to all kinds of devilry. That can lead to all kinds of ruin. So we see right away in Abram's story that restored communion with God is the priority. That must precede restored dominion. You don't want sinners having dominion without restored communion. The first priority is for people to learn to live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, to listen to Him, to trust Him, to obey Him, as Adam and Eve did not. And so Abram is brought to Canaan to learn to live by what? To learn to live by faith. He has no seed. What are the three promises? Land, seed, blessing. He has no seed. The land is inhabited. You know, can you imagine him showing up like, yay, God's promised me a land. He gets there and there's a people everywhere. This place is full of Canaanites. He's not going to take dominion here. At least not yet. He's been promised dominion. He's been promised fruitfulness, promised blessing in this new Eden. But that will not be until he and eventually his seed have learned the lessons of faith. Only then will they be fit to work and keep this garden and extend it to the ends of the earth, which is why Abram and a number of his offspring lead what seem like very unproductive lives. These are not flashy lives. There's not a lot going on. There's a lot of just waiting. Why? Because we need to learn the lessons of faith. Communion precedes dominion. Now notice Abram's initial responses to this initial package of promises. First of all, it is an extraordinary display of faith that this man, this sinner, Paul calls him ungodly in Romans. This sinner, by the grace of God, gets up and goes when God calls him. He follows. Abram is the paradigm example of followership. I'll believe you, God. I will do what you say. You want to know what following God looks like? That's it. I believe you. I will follow you. That is called discipleship or followership. And Abram is a disciple. He gets up and he goes. He just follows. I believe you, God, and so I do what you say. Even though he probably at this point in his life doesn't connect all of the dots of the macro story, he may not fully realize yet even how his story relates to everything that's gone before him, although in time you'll see he begins to connect those dots. So first of all, he follows. That's glorious. Secondly, it appears right away that he begins to gather people around him through witnessing. He follows, and secondly, it's pretty clear that he witnesses, because you'll notice in chapter 12, verse 5, we're told he took Sarai his wife, Lot his brother's son, all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had literally made in Haran. Now, Haran's the stopping point between Ur and Canaan. It's where Abram's father Terah dies 60 years after Abram moves on to finally get to Canaan. But while he is in Haran, Abram starts, quote-unquote, making people. Not literally making people, but the idea seems to be that he is making souls. He is making followers. He is making disciples. He is gathering people around him. He is making up an entourage of people who are going to go to Canaan with him. So he follows, he witnesses, and thirdly, when he gets to Canaan, you'll notice, his major activity at first is just to worship. Verse 6, passes through the land. He kind of goes from north to south. And what we see is we see him building altars. As he's moving south through the land, he's kind of building altars at various stopping off points along the way. You remember back the Sethites is what we saw them doing over against the city builders of Cain and his line. The Sethites are building altars and calling upon the name of the Lord. They are worshipers, and Abram is filling this land with worship. He's going through making memorials to worship, and that is the heart and the pulse of God's restored kingdom on earth. You know, you can talk about all kinds of other stuff that's flashy and it seems so vital, you know, big dominion projects and mission projects. At the heart of God's kingdom is a people that praise and proclaim Him, who worship and witness for Him. You'll also notice, just as a very quick aside, that as soon as Abram enters the land, in verse 7, the Lord does something else. He doesn't just speak, He appears. This is called a theophany, or a revelation of God, some visible revelation of God. It's the first theophany in the Bible there. God's presence appears to Abram here because God's presence is attached to this land in some particular way, harking back to His presence in the Garden in Eden. Now, after these very promising beginnings, guess what happens? Things seem like they're going well. Abram begins to experience increasingly severe testing. Now, I don't know who else is listening to this or will listen to this in the future, but if you are a follower of God, you are a follower of the true and living God and of Jesus Christ, his Son, you are undoubtedly, as you learn to walk in faith, you are experiencing testing. This is how God works. He tests faith. And Abram is tested. He doesn't just travel to a faraway land that turns out to be inhabited. That's discouraging enough. But now, Abram experiences a major natural disaster. This is what you want to have happen right after you've come, 1,100 miles to a land that turns out to be inhabited. You're kind of sitting around waiting. What now, God? Oh, a famine. And now the land is uninhabitable. That's thrilling. That's just what you hope will happen, right? And so he goes looking for help. It's interesting. Tests of faith are always tests of wisdom. Some of you know this so well by experience. When your faith is tested, your wisdom is tested. All of a sudden, God's made promises. They aren't working out. In fact, the opposite of what God has promised seems to be working out. And so what do? And that test of faith, trusting God, becomes also a test of wisdom. What do you do now? What's the right path forward when things are not working out well? And so he goes down into Egypt, and he encounters a situation that actually threatens his wife, Sarai, and threatens any seed they're going to have together, because she's taken into Pharaoh's house, as the beautiful woman that she is. She's hauled off to Pharaoh's house, and if Pharaoh has a child with her, that obviously compromises Abram's seed, and it obviously could compromise his ability even to keep his wife. It seems to me that Abram, as her self-proclaimed brother in this situation, might have thought that as her brother she would be consulted before any suitors took her or whatever. Who knows? I mean, Pharaoh's not at all happy with him when he finds out that this is in fact Abram's wife, after the Lord has afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great, what? Plagues? Ring a bell? God afflicts Pharaoh in verse 17 in his house with great plagues, and Pharaoh realizes she's Abram's wife, and he's not at all happy with Abram. Whether or not we share Pharaoh's assessment of Pharaoh's assessment of Abram's blameworthiness, is he really blameworthy here? Did he lack faith? Is that why he kind of put his wife in this compromised situation? Was it just a lack of wisdom? Pharaoh's kind of disgusted, but I don't know if we should be disgusted. Maybe it was just the best he could do under the circumstances with the wisdom he had. But one thing is very clear from the story, and I wouldn't get too lost in whether Abram really did something wrong here. The dominant emphasis in the story seems very clearly to be this. And remember who's writing this and who's reading this. This is written by Moses, and Israel's getting ready to go into the land of Canaan after coming out of what? After coming out of Egypt. And the message here to Israel, the Israelites having experienced the Exodus now as they're reading this story, they look back to their father Abram and realize God will fight for this man and his seed, and will deliver him from Egypt, and will, even if he has to bring plagues on the Pharaoh, and he will bring this man back to the land of promise, because that is the land that God promised to him. And this is the beginning here of Abram's quote-unquote great name. Back in verse 2, you'll see God promises to make his name great, and now Abram is known as a man who has God on his side. Psalm 105:15, it says that God spoke to the nations in the days of our fathers, saying, quote, touch not my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm, unquote. And this is really the beginning of that. Abram is now developing a reputation as a man who has got some very significant divine power on his side. So after that initial testing, we come to the trouble that begins in his relationship with Lot. Chapter 13. So as Abram leaves Egypt, laden with the riches of Egypt, further testing awaits him. The land to which he returns, very likely because of the famine conditions, which would have only been relieved recently, the land, it turns out, cannot support him and all of his flocks and herds, and cannot support Lot with him. So the two of them together are too much. Maybe there's just not a lot of great pasture land yet because of the famine, who knows, but the land cannot support them both. And it's so striking here how Abram, to whom this land was promised, incidentally, it was not promised to Lot, but to Abram, he refuses in this conflict with Lot to seize what God had promised to him by driving out his nephew Lot. He could have just said, fine, this is my land, out you go. Go figure it out. Go back to Egypt or something. Abram does not do that. Abram is patient. Abram is generous. His faith in God, probably bolstered significantly by what just happened in Egypt. He knows God is with me. God is for me. It makes him patient, and it makes him generous in this conflict with Lot. His faith in God works here by love, doesn't it? Even to the point of offering to be the one who moves. He basically says to Lot, you pick the land, and I'll be the one to pack up all my stuff and move elsewhere. An incredible inconvenience, but he's willing to do it. And so when Lot seizes the Eden-like land, it's very interesting how the land that Lot chooses is described. In chapter 3, verse 10, the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of Yahweh, like the land of Egypt, in fact, in the direction of Zoar. So Lot goes for the Eden land, the land that obviously looks like the Garden of Eden. And he picks the best of the land. And Abram, it's so interesting, manifests, as we will see in a moment, no resentment about that whatsoever. His faith in God is so strong. Now you can contrast Lot's seeming obliviousness, if not worse, his obliviousness to the significance of God's promises. Lot is concerned only here for his own material interest. That seems to be all he is thinking about. He doesn't have any particular regard for whether he remains in this promised land to which God's presence is attached and his blessing is attached. Lot doesn't care. He's moving east. That's always a bad sign in Genesis. He's moving east. And he doesn't seem even particularly concerned about whether he stays connected to God's people. I mean, it is Abram who's the father of promise, and Lot is willing to separate away from him. Lot could have found some other way where he could have at least stayed in touch with his uncle, but he just manifests no real concern to maintain any kind of relationship with Abram. He just moves away without looking back. And the results for him, as we will see later in Genesis, are, of course, disastrous. Now, God's response to, so the contrast of Abram's faith and Lot's obliviousness, or worse, but God's response to Abram's faith under this severe testing is to speak again in chapter 13, verse 14. He speaks to Abram, and he says, I want you to walk through this land. I want you to lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are. Look everywhere you can see, north, south, east, west, all the land that you see, I will give to you. Get up, Abram, walk through the land. 360 degrees. It's all going to belong to you and to your seed forever. And when God calls Abram to walk all through the land, of course, what does Abram do? He obeys, just as he did back in Ur of the Chaldeans. And God has comforted him with some fresh promises. Now that brings us to chapter 14. A very strange rescue mission. Some wild stuff happens here. The humility and the patience and the love that spring from the soil of Abram's faith there in chapter 13 in his conflict with Lot. That humility, patience, and love are all the more remarkable in light of the events of chapter 14. Now, chapter 14. The major news item at the time is an alliance of 4 kings who come from back near where Abram originated. 4 mighty kings from the east side of the Fertile Crescent, near Ur, near the territory of Nimrod, you might remember him. And together these 4 mighty kings rule an astonishingly vast swath of territory. In fact, even 5 cities, we learn, clear out west in the Jordan Valley are vassal cities of these 4 mighty kings of the east. Now, after a dozen years of serving the 4, well, I'll call them the big 4 in the east, a city, the 5 cities in the Jordan Valley form a rebel alliance, and the response of the big 4, as they learn about this rebellion in the west, the big 4 respond swiftly and they respond brutally. In verses 5 through 11, they come out, and their retaliatory campaign drives them deep into Canaan, and they crush, we're told, even 3 people groups called the Rephaim, the Zuzim, and the Emim. If you take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 2 later sometime, you might learn that these 3 people groups are likely renowned giants. But the 4 kings are phenomenally powerful. from a military point of view. And they come in and they crush the Rephaim and the Zuzim and the Emim, and they come after these 5 cities of the rebel alliance. And this battle ensues in verse 8 and following, here in chapter 14, in which the rebels end up being routed. They just cannot even stand up against the big 4. And as the news later reaches Abram in faraway Mamre, in verse 13, Lot, as a citizen of one of those cities, is captured. Now, if there was ever an I told you so moment, this surely is it. Abram could have said, you know what, the young fool went off by himself, he got himself in a mess, he made his bed, he can sleep in it. But Abram, who, as a man of faith, he's also a man of great peace. He loves his nephew, despite all the ways that Lot has wronged him. There's no resentment here, there's no bitterness here, there's only open-handed generosity. The generosity he showed in chapter 13 is even more displayed here, and it's all coming out of his confidence in God. He doesn't have to be at war with Lot because he knows God is for him. Now, being a man of peace does not mean that he's a pacifist when it comes to confronting violent aggression and injustice such as has been perpetrated by these 4 kings. So with his trained household servants in verse 14 and 3 confederates, he starts chasing after the big 4. Now, this is a fight that he's doomed to lose. Some 450 miles north, he chases these mighty kings, and here's something absolutely amazing happens, because even allowing that maybe, we're not being told all the details here, and that Abram's force might have been larger than the 318 people that are mentioned there in verse 14, the household servants. Maybe he's got a little bit bigger force than that, and maybe we could even speculate that these eastern kings might have sent relatively small, fast-moving units out to the west to fight all these battles. The odds are still outrageously against Abram doing anything here. And yet, in an almost infuriatingly casual tone, Moses just tells us here as he writes that Abram trounced these 4 kings and brought back everything that they had taken as spoils. And you ask yourself, if Abram is such a phenomenal freedom fighter, why doesn't he just take over Canaan? Well, the answer to that question emerges in something very mysterious that happens after the battle, one of the truly mysterious and beautiful encounters in all of Scripture. Because Abram comes back after his defeat of Kedorlaomer and the kings, verse 17. And, of course, the king of Sodom, which we would expect, comes out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And so in this encounter in the valley of the king, we expect the king of Sodom, one of the aggrieved kings, but who is this 10th king? We got the 5 rebel kings, the big 4 that Abram defeated, but there's a 10th king here, Melchizedek. His name means the king of righteousness. He's not mentioned before this or after this anywhere in the Genesis story. He's the king of Salem, the king of the city of peace. And stranger still is the way that Abram acts in his presence here. This is just bizarre. We learn that this Melchizedek is the priest of El Elyon, God Most High, verse 18. He was the priest of El Elyon. He represents, as priest, he represents God, El Elyon, to man, in this case Abram, and he represents man before God. And nobody here questions his credentials. We're just told he's the priest. As God's priest, he comes to refresh Abram. He brings royal food, the food of kings, bread and wine. And he comes to bless him, to say to him in the flesh, God, El Elyon, who owns heaven and earth, Abram, is for you. Now, he makes some very strong claims because he explicitly claims the glory of this victory for El Elyon. Blessed be El Elyon, verse 20, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Lest anybody, run away with the credit here. This fight belonged to El Elyon. As Abraham did his duty to go rescue his nephew, El Elyon, God Most High, was working. He's essentially, Melchizedek is saying to Abram here, on God's behalf, my blessing, speaking for God here, my blessing is your resource. My blessing, Abram, is your reward. And without even blinking, Abram just submits to that claim. There's no grasping on his part at all here. He opens his hand and gives a tenth of everything. Just utterly amazing. You can imagine what the king of Sodom must have been thinking, watching his stuff that's been brought back, a tenth of it being given to this priest. And in doing that, Abram is acknowledging what was just spoken by God's king priest. El Elyon is my benefactor. El Elyon is my Lord. El Elyon is the true victor over my enemies. It is El Elyon from whom everything comes. He is the owner of heaven and earth, and he is my king, and I entrust myself to him. He has blessed me, and everything I am and have belongs to him. This is the kind of Sabbath moment after the work of dominion taking in this war. You know, we have the 6 days of work, the seventh day of rest, a time to rest and acknowledge all that we have gained in our days of labor is from the Lord in any event. Now, the king of Sodom, you can imagine, is a little irritated by this, perhaps. He has no use for El Elyon. He interrupts, and he demands that Abram give him the persons, the souls, verse 21. But he says, you take the goods for yourself. That's a very interesting thing to say, because in that apparent generosity, here you take all the goods, all the spoils for yourself. There is a trap. And Abram senses it immediately. Unlike Eve in the garden, he senses immediately the serpentine trap that's at work here. Because what is the king of Sodom saying, given what Melchizedek just said? The king of Sodom is saying, these spoils are mine to dispose of. I will make you rich, Abram. And your obligation is now to me. You'll be beholden to me. This king is making a claim that is directly antithetical to the one just made by El Elyon's king priest. And Abram wants nothing to do with it. He says, I will not take a shoestring. I will not take a thread from you. Because Abram's allegiance is to Salem, not to Sodom. His allegiance is to the city of Salem and its king, El Elyon, not to Sodom and its wicked lord. And he will not bow the knee and be beholden to the city of Sodom. That's why Abram does not use military force to conquer Canaan. Because the land, the kingdom, is El Elyon's. And he gives it to whomever he will. And Abram knows that very well. What God promises to his people, God must give. This is a kingdom, Abram understands, as he's beginning to put together the pieces of all these promises in which really the kingdom of God itself on earth is encapsulated. This kingdom comes by grace. It does not come by human force and human cunning. It cannot be secured by our works. And to Moses readers, it would have been important to know this kingdom as it comes cannot be hindered by the power and the works and the cunning of Israel's enemies. God gives it to whomever he will, no matter how many spears are bristling on the walls of the Canaanite cities in Moses' time. Subtly, this text is setting up salvation by grace through faith. But it's also setting up the patience and the confidence of saints as we, even today, await the unfolding of God's kingdom in history, even after the arrival of the great King, our Messiah, Jesus himself. We're still waiting for many of the components of God's full kingdom on earth to be unveiled and to find full expression. And there is patience and there is confidence as we learn to use the weapons of a warfare that is not carnal, because we trust in the Lord. Some trust in chariots and horses. We remember the name of the Lord our God. And in Israel's history, I think too, there is something else going on in this particular text, and that is a reminder not to trust in human kings, but also not to trust in human priests, but to look for a priest after the order of Melchizedek, to whom Abram was subject long before the priesthood of Aaron. Now, as we close this narrative, because this is all maybe stirring stuff, and we can see how much God has done here to encourage Abram's faith, but I think there's good reason to believe as we close this, that despite the blessing of El Elyon's priest and the boldness of his own oath, Abram is struggling with some fear, with some doubt. Because as he goes home after meeting Melchizedek, with all the encouragement of that glorious encounter, there's no hint of a baby on the horizon. His logical heir, which would be Lot, has deserted him. There is no glimmer of hope at all that this land will soon be his. In fact, the land, he has learned, is not only still in the hands of Canaanites, but it's vulnerable to all kinds of foreign aggressions, foreign powers. He's still homeless, childless, and none the richer for his conquest because he left without a thread, without a shoe string. Just the promise of God. Are doubts gnawing at his mind here as we close? We're going to pick that up next time, as God picks this exact moment to come and to speak to his servant Abram once again. But that we'll have to wait until lesson 7, where we will tackle the chapters 15 through 17 and the amazing covenant that God cuts with his servant. Now, I always leave a little bit of time if anybody would like to fire off any questions here. We've got the live chat open. You guys, I see some comments have been made tonight, which is great, and you guys can ask questions at any time throughout any of these broadcasts. But I'll give just a moment here. But if nobody's got any questions, we're going to we'll close up the lesson, and hope you guys have enjoyed this. And I look forward to being with you all next time as we continue through the story of Abram's life. God's peace.